Welcome to Pod Save America. I'm Jon Favreau.
I'm Jon Lovett.
I'm Tommy Vietor.
Joe Biden comes home from Europe this week to a Republican Party that's trying to kill most of his legislative agenda and a small gang of moderate Democrats who either can't see that or won't stop it. And now there's new evidence that Washington's bipartisan clusterfuck is starting to take a toll on everyone involved. After about 5 months of the president enjoying an incredibly steady average approval rating of between 53 and 54%, 538.com has Biden's average approval at 51.8%, a tick down, but still the lowest of his presidency. The new Monmouth poll came out last week, has Biden's approval at 48%, a 6-point decrease from April, but a fall that's being driven largely by Democrats, the percentage of who said the country is on the wrong track also rose by 20 points to nearly 1 in 3. For Congress, it's even worse. Just 32% of Democrats approve, down from 63% in April. I should say that the approval ratings for Biden in Congress have taken a hit with independents as well. Lovett, what do you think is causing this slight but real dip?
I think he's, we're losing that new Biden smell a little bit. There's a moment. Look, there's a moment
what
when.
Does that? Can you describe what that smells like?
That's not. No, but there is a moment where your new car becomes your car, and it's like the first time you grind the hubcaps against a curb, or like you ding this, or like when it's just your car. One thing I think is interesting, it's like one of the reasons Biden's approval rating has been so steady is actually that he didn't get the kind of honeymoon with Republicans that normal presidents have gotten in the past. Even Barack Obama got just a decade ago. And I think the result of that is actually we'd be having a different conversation about President Biden's approval rating, like kind of like coming down to earth. But for the fact that, misinformation and propaganda means that his numbers paid like a tax from the beginning. And actually a bunch of Republicans have kind of ticked up their support because he's not the monster, the incoherent, wandering, demented monster that he was painted to be, controlled by like a marionette by Vice President Kamala Harris. And that said, I think going from weeks of Joe Biden's on a roll, he's addressing the pandemic and passing big bills, to headlines like, is Joe Biden's agenda stalled for good? Don't help, your approval rating amongst the people who supported you.
Well, Tommy, the same poll shows that Biden's policies are still as popular as ever. 60% support the American Rescue Plan, 68% support the American Jobs Plan, and 61% support the American Families Plan. What do you make of the gap between Biden's popularity now and the popularity of his plans?
I mean, isn't it true that everyone hates the kid who just got back from their year abroad in Europe and like pronounces Barcelona with the TH, and like that could be part of it? I mean, I think there's a few pieces of this, right?
Won't stop talking about all his new friends that he made. Yeah, we get it. It was great.
You love prosciutto? Okay, way to really go crazy with your palate. I mean, there's a couple pieces of this, right? Like you said, the Biden approval dropped, congressional approval dropped, and then the right track, wrong track numbers also dropped. So to me, that suggests frustration among Democrats based on feeling like, oh, maybe this is, the agenda's bogged down in Congress, like some of the headlines Lovett talked about. And then I think there's other concerns that are like, concerns about inflation that I think are making people feel a little more anxious about the economy, a little more anxious about how we're going to exit this COVID period. And it's just something to keep an eye on. I mean, in terms of that gap, I think a lot of it, like Lovett was saying, the gap, a lot of it comes from the fact that Republican voters don't just dislike Joe Biden, they intensely dislike him. I think 6 out of 10 Republican voters have a strong disapproval of Biden. I think that's not Joe Biden's fault, right? That tells you a lot about the damage that was done by months and months and months of lies that claim Joe Biden stole the election. And so ultimately it's easier for a voter to like an idea from a politician they don't like. There were some Trump ideas I liked, but in this case, it's some vanilla stuff like roads and bridges. But again, you also probably are seeing some of a delta here because there's high approval from Democrats for the policy ideas, and then maybe a little bit of frustration about the effort to pass it or what they perceive as a lack of effort to pass it. So that's the way I would square that circle.
Yeah, I think that's it. Shit's not getting done. I mean, we had, at the beginning of the term, he passes the American Rescue Plan. He's the next FDR, right? We're already putting him on Mount Rushmore. We're talking about this transformative presidency, which was, probably a bit of an over-exaggeration, just a bit, because the media tends to do that sometimes. And now, like Lovett said, you're seeing all these headlines about a stalled agenda. And if you're someone who thinks the plans are great, but don't see them getting passed, and all you hear every fucking week is Joe Manchin says no and stalled in Congress and this and that. Like, you're gonna get frustrated, and you're gonna, I mean, Lovett, do you think Democrats are right to feel disappointed and frustrated so far?
Yeah, I mean, of course, yes. I don't. Where they direct that, I think, is more at issue. I think even like all but the most committed watchers of politics are not as familiar with like the the vagaries of the Senate, the filibuster, the fact that Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema are putting up hurdles. That like, why is there a bipartisan infrastructure bill versus the better bill? What is the status of that? I think that all ends up sounding a bit like noise and nothing changing. So I think like that frustration is valid. I think the question is it right to point it at Joe Biden? I think like, of course, in part, I think not. I think, is it right to point that entirely at Joe Biden? Of course not. Is there a criticism? Is it worth exploring like the criticism mounted sometimes by the left of like Joe Biden's strategy to get some of these things done? Like, of course, that's what we talk about. That's what we should be talking about. But overall, being frustrated at the fact that like we can't get some of these big items through a Democratic Senate with a Democratic House and a Democratic presidency, like, yeah, that's really fucking frustrating.
Tommy, what else do you think Joe Biden could be doing? I mean, let's sort of assess how much blame and responsibility Joe Biden should get for this stalled agenda versus like what he can actually do to get it moving. What do you think?
I mean, a couple things. So like there's some tactical stuff. I did notice that the Democratic Party has been running a lot of paid digital ads about these bills, about some of his accomplishments. I think I saw that in the last couple months, the DSCC has spent like $1.7 million on Google ads and Facebook ads to promote the American Jobs Plan. So I think that's good and important because, as Lovett said, like I'm sure there's a lot of Democratic voters who are listening to Pod Save America and watching MSNBC and pissed off about the filibuster and blah, blah, blah. Then there's just like most of the country that is going outside for the first time and going to the movies and not wearing a mask and just like living their lives. And I think the way you're going to reach a lot of those people who are just not paying as much attention is through paid ads. I hope that the Biden team will end up pushing Manchin and others a little harder behind the scenes to acknowledge some of the urgency we're seeing, especially around issues like voting rights. I hope they also find some wedge issues that we can talk about that makes the debate more uncomfortable for Republicans. And it's not somehow just about Biden. Like, I'm guessing like Biden doesn't want to dig into this hard or go after Republicans hard right now and give McConnell or others a pretext for blowing up bipartisan talks. But the fact that Republicans refuse to raise taxes on rich people or corporations, but want to raise the gas tax on every person in the country seems like a political gift to me. And I would like to hear more ways that they are going to elevate that contrast and drive it home in the home stretch. So there's a few things there.
I think that's all right. I wonder how much of the Manchin pushing should happen behind the scenes and how much should start happening a little bit more publicly. And I know you have to be careful of this because every time you say anything about Joe Manchin, if Joe Biden even says the words Joe Manchin, it's treated in the press as a jab.
Yep.
And
Yeah.
Tommy loves this especially. But like I do.
Jabs.
Look, this is a tough one, right? We were all in the White House when the narrative about Obama was Obama must lead. Why won't Obama lead? And like, Dan and I talked about Green Lantern theory, and there's this idea that the president can like magically bend the entire city of Washington to his will. But I do wonder like how much I kind of think that Joe Biden so far has been like a manager and he needs to be more like a fighter, right? Like they talk about him like he's managing the pandemic well, he's managing the economy well, he's getting us back. And I think a little more fight on behalf of the middle class, like you're saying too, Tommy, by saying like we need to tax the wealthy, we need to help fight for inequality, we need to help fight for people in this country, right? Like a little more fighting spirit and a little less managing through public remarks. I don't know that that's going to change Joe Manchin's mind. I think we should be very clear on that. But I think you might as well try to fight because at the end of the day, you're going to own the success or failure, despite whether it's Joe Manchin's fault or not.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is like this is the exact place on the dial of Joe Biden's approval rating in June of 2021 is like incidental. Like we are talking about passing $1 trillion infrastructure package. There is talk of potentially following that with a much bigger partisan kind of bill that does a bunch of different pieces of the infrastructure plan, of the family plan. And I think if we are talking about like what Joe Biden has to do to be a successful president, like the message takes a backseat to whether or not he succeeds in passing those two things. Like that is the question. And I don't feel like we like
no message can fix if the either the bipartisan infrastructure deal or the larger reconciliation bill don't pass, or if the For the People Act doesn't pass. No messaging is going to fix that.
No, and like Joe Biden is an incredibly consistent messenger. His approval rating was higher when he was showing incredible contrast to the failed pandemic management that came before him and passing a giant piece of legislation. You know, like that really helps. That is his message. So anything like so basically like a lot of this comes down to what will move Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema and a few other moderates to making that agenda pass. And like we just honestly, I think sometimes we don't fully understand the conversations that are taken behind the scenes, like what the tenor is, what the actual posture is.
Yeah, I mean, with these numbers, I think, like for the reelect, like, do I think that a bunch of Democrats are gonna decide they're so disappointed that they vote for Donald Trump again or Tom Cotton, whoever they put up? No, but I do think like this kind of reduced enthusiasm is something that we should be mindful of and concerned about as we go into the midterms, which are usually entirely about getting your base out. I do think like, look, I like fundamentally agree with their theory of the case that like we got to do a good job, we got to get the pandemic behind us, we got to fix the economy. But I think like we have also seen some warnings about, you know, thinking that's a panacea. Like economic indicators are increasingly partisan. Trump's president, Republicans are psyched about the economy. Democrats president, they're bummed out, right? It's increasingly difficult to reach voters to tell them what you actually did. Fox News watchers are only going to hear about like critical race theory or the cultural grievance of the day. Sporadic voters aren't going to read the news at all, or they're going to read Facebook. And then lastly, like the thing that would really concern me the most is that the best economy, the best economic ratings in the world are going to struggle to overcome a super gerrymandered map or like harsh voter suppression laws, or worse yet, like a state legislature that just decides they're going to change the results of an election they don't like. So like that's why this push on voting rights is maybe the most important thing he does, because like that is just looming in the background. It's something that should freak all of us out.
I agree, and I think, you know, if I was in the White House advising him, like I think he should be out here. I think he should be out there even more on voting rights, right? Like Schumer's going to put up the For the People Act, either the Joe Manchin version or the original version or both, Tuesday, and like Joe Biden should be out there and he should be fighting for this bill and he should be fighting for this compromise. You know, there's reports that the White House is going to embrace the Manchin compromise. That's fine. Look, if you get all 50 Senate Democrats and most of the House on board with this Manchin compromise, and Joe Biden is supportive too, then go out there and fight for that, and fight for it hard. And it still might not make a difference. You might not convince these Democrats to break the filibuster like Manchin and Sinema, but you got to go down swinging on this one. I agree, Tommy. Look, there are some economic indicators that are still mixed, right? So the Biden people would say probably it's too early, right? Like it's gonna take some time for the economy to get back to full strength. It's gonna take some time still for more people to get vaccinated, for the pandemic to fully go away. Once that happens, though, people will feel the results of that, and they will support Joe Biden based on that feelings. But I agree with you, Tommy, that you know, because we are in such a polarized environment, I do not know if simply improving people's lives and having them feel that improvement is enough to get Democrats over the finish line.
One other thing, though, that I feel like the Biden team has been like really kind of good about, especially like not like on like sort of economic indicators generally, just like, hey, this summer is gonna be really fucking weird, all right, and everybody just needs to chill out. Like inflation, job numbers, like the consumer, consumer behavior, like we're all fucked up. We're all behaving in a new way, like coming out of a pandemic for the first time in 100 years. And like some of this is like, I imagine, going to be reflected in just polling that we're not going to be able to totally trust or understand for a little bit of time. Like this is an odd moment. There's a lot of noise.
Also, God knows what we're going to be talking about as we go into the midterms or the reelect. It could be the economy. It could be China. It could be terrorism. It could be like critical race theory for pets. Like who the fuck knows what Fox News is going to drive and force us to talk about for the next couple of years. So,
and then,
I think they're right. Like,
there's that article in the New Yorker. There's that article in New Yorker that I think about every once in a while about Seattle falling into the ocean. That just I'm reminded of once in a while. You know, just it's out there.
I couldn't read it.
But that's why, like, if you're the Biden folks, if you're Democrats, you want to be going into these midterms with voters looking at Biden and looking at Democrats and saying, these are the people who are fighting for me and the Republicans are not. Right. It's not just like, we're going to give you marks on how you handled the pandemic and the economy. This, like, there's going to be all these fights and I want these people on my side because I think they're on my side. And so you have to show that. And you have to show that through your messaging and also what you actually get done. All right. The Supreme Court still has 12 opinions left to issue in this term, but already some of its rulings and unexpected coalitions have sparked a debate about just how conservative the newest justices are, including last week's 7-2 decision to uphold the Affordable Care Act for the third time. Joining us to make sense of all this is NYU professor of law and co-host of the Strict Scrutiny podcast, Melissa Murray. Melissa, welcome back to the pod.
Thanks for having me back.
Let's start with California versus Texas, where the court said that a group of Republican states did not have the standing to challenge the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act, an opinion that was written by Justice Breyer and joined not only by the liberal justices, but by Justices Roberts, Thomas, Kavanaugh, and Barrett. Melissa, why do you think these conservative justices signed on? And what, if anything, can this ruling tell us about how the court views the ACA?
Well, to be clear, this was a ruling on procedural grounds that the litigants did not have standing to bring these claims. So technically, the court did not get into the merits of this case at all. So it's not as though the conservative justices who signed on to, quote unquote, save the ACA were signing on or endorsing the idea of federally subsidized health care in any way. So, this whole idea that the ACA has been saved by this opinion and by these conservative justices, I think, is a little misstated. It is a narrow procedural decision about who may enter federal court and present what kinds of claims. And, it is the kind of decision, I think, that the court often deploys using these procedural grounds in order to avoid a thornier or more controversial issue. So just think back to 2013 when we had the first marriage equality case, Perry versus Hollingsworth, that came before the court. That was also dismissed on standing grounds, in part because I think the court was not ready in 2013 to take up the broader question of whether the right to marry included a right to marry the person of the same sex. And so we punted there, the court punted there, and then 2 years later, we got the decision in Obergefell versus Hodges, where apparently they were ready.
Justice Alito issued a fairly catty dissent where he sarcastically referred to this case as the third in an epic trilogy and said no one can fail to be impressed by the lengths to which this court has been willing to go to defend the ACA against all threats. What do you think that was all about?
I think you're right. It was a bowl of milk for table two. It was very catty. And I think the cattiness or the snarkiness was really directed at the Chief Justice who, very famously in 2012 voted with the liberals to uphold the ACA in the first instance. And then later the majority widened, but the Chief Justice was again in the majority to uphold the ACA once again in King versus Burwell. So, Justice Alito's dissent here was notable in that the decision written by Justice Breyer was a relatively spare and efficient 16 pages, and Justice Alito's dissent is twice that. And, he is really all in his feelings about this. He's very exercised. The more notable thing, though, I think Justice Alito being very perplexed and perturbed about this is not surprising. I think anyone could have predicted that. I think what is less predictable is that he got Justice Gorsuch to join him on this dissent. And, it is a dissent that is sort of broadly thinking about, the purposes of the ACA, what Congress was doing when it zeroed out the individual mandate penalty, all of these things that really sort of focus on what was Congress thinking at the time they did certain things. And Neil Gorsuch is not the guy who cares about what Congress was trying to do at any particular moment. He's the guy who cares about what did Congress write on the page and what can someone reading the words that Congress wrote, what do they mean? He is a committed textualist, but this is a dissent that is really more about Congress's purposes, Congress's motivations, not about what did Congress write.
Yeah, it's alarming. Lovett, reporters were asking Democrats last week whether they regret arguing last fall that Justice Barrett would overturn the Affordable Care Act if given the chance. Would you like to issue an apology?
No, obviously not. I rarely issue apologies when they're earned. But look, I'm not a lawyer or an expert. I have a great LSAT score. I'd like Melissa to know that. But it seems to me that a lot of this is treating Amy Coney Barrett and actually the court generally as like a magic 9 ball, I guess. And that, but tell me if I'm wrong, but like she was very explicit about her ideology. She said she's a radical. She's a radical in her reading of the Constitution, but in her writings and in what she said in her hearings, she talked about the ways in which she avoids applying that. And in this case, they didn't rule on the Affordable Care Act. For all we know, and I think we would all bet, I don't know what Melissa would say about this, but we'd bet that she does believe the Affordable Care Act is unconstitutional, but she didn't have to rule on that because didn't get that far because they threw it out on standing, which is just about the right to bring the suit in the first place.
So I'm just going to reach over here and signs point to yes. I think that's right.
Melissa does have a magic 8-ball for those of you listening at home. She just held.
What'd you think of Magic 9-ball?
I got where I was perplexed at first, but then I got where you were going with it. I like
Thank
that.
you.
I like that. So I think we all need to be mindful of the context in which this occurred. I mean, we were discussing whether or not the Supreme Court would strike down the healthcare statute in the middle of what is the most pronounced global health crisis that we have seen in our lifetime. And, I think any legal realist would say that most people on the court, even the committed conservatives, would worry about what that looked like, would worry about what it would mean for the court going forward were they to do that. And so I think it's entirely not surprising that the court would find this procedural way to avoid that broader question of whether or not the ACA or the individual mandate continues to be constitutional or unconstitutional by dealing with it in this very narrow jurisdictional way. I don't think that means that Amy Coney Barrett is now in favor of the Affordable Care Act. I don't think it makes her a progressive. I don't think it means much of anything at all, except that some majority of the court was unwilling to take up that bigger question. And this procedural out, and I think often these procedural decisions are outs, was a way to avoid that more thorny question.
Love it. You have some questions on Fulton for Melissa.
Yeah, so one other big case was Fulton v. Pennsylvania. The Supreme Court ruled that the city
of Philadelphia. City of Philadelphia.
What did I say?
Pennsylvania.
Oh, sorry.
Not the
That's right.
city.
I'm starting again. It's a podcast. We can edit. So
Tell me more about your LSAT score.
Leave that in.
Sorry.
Now you're screwing me. Now you're making good content.
Just joking.
The other big case was Fulton versus City of Pennsylvania. The Supreme Court ruled that the city violated the First Amendment when it denied a Catholic foster care agency a contract because they discriminate against married same-sex couples. Were you surprised that this was a unanimous decision? And why was Samuel Alito so pissed about it?
Okay, so lots to say about this. This is a decision, again, the unanimity I think is a little deceptive. And, I think it raises the question, why did the liberals on the court sign on to a decision that basically allows the city of Philadelphia to allow Catholic services to administer this portion of their foster care system, and in doing so to discriminate against same-sex couples? I think the reason the liberals joined this is because it's really narrowly written. They talk specifically about the idea that because the city of Philadelphia's policies allows for exemptions, that means that they are necessarily considering religion as part of it, and that just is a discrimination against religion. But more importantly, the fact that there are exemptions means that this is not a generally applicable law that is neutral towards religion, which means it takes off the table the broader question of whether this 1990 decision, Employment Division versus Smith, should be overruled. Because according to the majority, Smith isn't applicable here because this law doesn't implicate Smith because it allows for these exceptions, and therefore it is not generally applicable or neutral. I think that's the reason why the liberals joined this. It is the least of the two evils. This could have been a very sweeping decision that overruled Employment Division versus Smith, which is a 1990s case that basically says you don't get an out from neutral laws of general applicability like anti-discrimination laws just because there is some incidental burden on religion. Wiping out Smith would basically allow almost any religious entity to claim that a neutral law had an impact on them because it required them to sort of change their behavior or to do something that they otherwise say that their religion would not allow them to do. So the prospect of overruling Smith was really huge. And I think if you look at some of the other cases that have come down this term, not necessarily on the court's regular docket, but on the shadow docket and the COVID docket, you can already see the sort of breadcrumbs being scattered that, Smith is not long for this world. So to me, the surprising thing was they didn't actually overrule Smith. And I think this is a kind of liberal appeasement. Like, we'll go along with you on this. We will allow Catholic services to discriminate against same-sex couples in foster care as long as you don't completely upend the way that we normally think about free exercise of religion by overruling Smith. And I think that's why Justice Scalia, or just see, Freudian slip, that's why Justice Alito is so exercised here, because I think he was one of the ones who took up this case for the express purpose of reorienting the free exercise doctrine by overruling Smith. And he says that in this dissent. Like, we have had so many invitations to take this up. So many people find that Smith is incoherent and out of step with current free exercise jurisprudence. We need to just correct this and get rid of this obviously erroneous decision. And the majority said, no dice, we're not doing that.
So I'm glad you brought that up, because these cases, look, I'm not a legal expert. I watch this like everybody else, and I end up being concerned about outcomes. Like, these are cases about discrimination against gay couples. There's the contraception mandate case that happened last year. But you brought up Smith. Smith is a Scalia decision, and was more concerned about free exercise being used to, like, justify things that were abhorrent to conservatives at the time, being things like gay marriage or drug use. And, because so much of this debate has been along this one partisan alignment, I'm actually just curious, like, how you think about this question of where free exercise meets these sort of exemptions, and like how progressive legal experts think about this, irrespective of outcomes.
So I think it's really important, the point that you made about the provenance of all of this. When Smith is decided in 1990s, and perhaps it's useful for your listeners to hear a little bit of the background of the case, this was a decision in which a Native American challenged his ineligibility for employment benefits. And the reason he was ineligible for unemployment benefits was because he was fired for using peyote, which is a hallucinogenic drug. But he argued his use of peyote was connected to his religious observance. He was Native American. This was part of one of their ceremonies, and that was the reason why he was using it. And so when he was fired and then made ineligible for the unemployment benefits because of the drug use, he said that was an infringement on his free exercise rights. The court comes in, and again, this is a Native American, so this is not a sort of traditional majority religion. The court says, this is a neutral law that just says you can't get unemployment benefits if the reason you're fired is because of drug use. It's not meant to hobble religion in any way. It's not meant to stick it to the faithful. It's just a general law of it's a neutral law of general applicability. And noted liberal Antonin Scalia writes it. Noted liberal William H. Rehnquist signs on to it. And, it's a pretty bipartisan composition of the court. Stevens is in there. O'Connor concurs there. I mean, it's not a liberal decision per se. It's just sort of, this is how they're viewing free exercise at the time. I don't think that free exercise has a particular ideological character, although more recently we have seen it become more muscular under the tutelage of the conservative justices, like a more expansive understanding of free exercise that serves conservative ideologies. But I don't think it has to be that way. So, for example, some very progressive Catholics have argued that they should be exempt from criminal laws that prohibit providing aid to migrants crossing the borders because their Catholic faith requires them to help and serve the indigent and those in distress. So you could understand that as a kind of free exercise accommodation of religious observance. But we, in the last couple of years, I think, have become more traditionally attuned to thinking about free exercise as something that serves evangelicals, conservatives, and conservative ideologies, but it doesn't have to be that way. And I think looking back where Smith started, you can just sort of see, like, that was a minority religious sect that is really illegible to our understanding of classical Christian or evangelical Christianity that has come to embody the free exercise clause today.
So those are the two big cases from last week. Melissa, I also want to get your take on this lead from last week's New York Times analysis of the Supreme Court's latest term. It starts, it's by Adam Liptak. It starts, Justice Amy Coney Barrett's arrival on the Supreme Court seemed to create a conservative juggernaut. Instead, its liberal wing is having a good run. Do you buy that?
I think rumors of the death of the conservative juggernaut have been grossly exaggerated in this particular instance. I think looking at just the argued cases, you might get the impression that this has been a big win for progressives across the board, but I don't think that's right. These are very, very narrow victories, if you want to call them victories, that really just sort of stave off a more desultory outcome that for progressives. I don't think these are the sort of full-throated, robust victories that people would like to see. More importantly, that analysis that LipTech offers doesn't take into account what has been happening on the shadow docket, which is that docket of emergency appeals that the court often takes up without full briefing or oral argument. And, we see a lot of the COVID cases, the death penalty cases on that docket, FDA versus ACOG, which was really important reproductive rights case earlier this year, that came up on the shadow docket. And those cases have been much, much more skewed to the conservative end of things. So to say that the court has somehow surprisingly liberal or surprisingly progressive, I think is to really miss the forest for the trees. You have to take all of this in concert. And there's a broader picture here than just what's been argued or these narrow decisions that we've just gotten. And we're also not done with the rest of this term.
Have you seen any indications that either Kavanaugh or Barrett might be less conservative than you expected?
I don't know that we've seen a lot from either of them. So, we had the NCAA case today where Justice Kavanaugh, noted basketball fan, wrote a concurrence in which he invited more cases to challenge whether the NCAA's policies, all of their policies, are consistent with antitrust laws, which suggests, I'm not saying that that's liberal or progressive, but it certainly seems activist, if you will, sort of the invitation to industries to bring more litigation before the court, which I think is interesting. Justice Barrett, we've only had, I think, one or two opinions from her, one majority, and then the concurrence in the ACA case. So I think it's a little too soon to tell. Next term, when we hear that major abortion case on the Mississippi abortion restriction in Dobbs, I think we'll get a better picture of what the addition of both of these justices might mean for the court going forward.
Lovett, do you think that even the appearance of unexpected moderation sort of hurts the movement to reform the Supreme Court?
Yeah, of course. Yes, of course it does. Absolutely. If the fact that if three liberal justices had written a broadside against a more sweeping decision against gay couples, I think we'd be having a different conversation. I think we'll be having a different conversation next year if Roe is either overturned or extremely limited. This is a long-term effort to reform the court. But the one thing I was curious about, what Melissa thought about this, was that even if there's a little bit of because the appearance of consensus, these stories about consensus may remove a little bit the wind from the sails, it does seem to me that there's still been some value to this kind of pressure from the outside. And I'm curious if you see some of the effort to kind of, by Roberts, to create bigger than 5-4 majorities or 6-3 majorities is in some way of a reflection of the fear of the pressure from the outside that this is a partisan institution, a Republican institution.
I think that's decidedly the case. And I don't think it's just the Chief Justice who worries about this. I think Justice Breyer is worried about this as well. I think one way that you could read these sets of decisions is sort of Justice Breyer making good on his point that, we can and should have compromise on the court. We shouldn't be talking about structural reform of the court. Instead, what we should be talking about is really getting the politics out of it. And I think you could take these, unanimous conservative or unanimous progressive victories as evidence of, Justice Breyer trying to cross the aisle, trying to work with his colleagues to fashion decisions where they can all get along. But again, the broader the majority, the narrower the decision ground is, again, and I think that suggests they're really not as close together as you think. They're actually quite far apart in terms of where they are on some of these issues. And in order to have that kind of unanimity or consensus, you really have to decide these cases quite narrowly. And, does that support or give fuel to the effort to reform the court? I don't know. But I don't think people talking about this term as a triumph of the liberals or the triumph of consensus is going to put much wind in the sails of those who favor structural reform, and I think maybe that's the point.
Even Alito, in one of his many angry missives, talks about how narrow some of these decisions are, as saying basically you're avoiding these big questions.
Yeah.
But speaking of working the refs, so Mitch McConnell has now said explicitly that he will not fill a Supreme Court seat if he's in the majority in 2024. He's even not committing to do it in 2023, which means basically we have until the, if there's a chance we lose the Senate, we have until the end of this congressional term to fill an open seat. Do you know, obviously, Justice Breyer is very concerned about politics and how it plays inside of the court. Do you know if he has access to the news? Does he know about the news?
I think he does. I'm pretty sure he knows that he is the subject of much discussion and speculation. I don't know that he cares. I think Justice Breyer is going to do what Justice Breyer is going to do, but it strikes me that the example of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, sort of trying to hold on until an election and ultimately not being able to, has got to be a kind of strong caveat to anyone who thinks about their position in a certain multi-member institution in a particular way. And as much as, he likes and wants consensus, I can't imagine that Justice Breyer does not recognize that the political winds are against consensus if he holds out for much longer. So, I don't know what that means, but surely he must be aware of it.
On his own terms. Like, if he's concerned about the politicization of the court, presumably one thing to avoid is a rending battle in which the sides decide they can't fill it because of partisan divisions.
No, I think that's exactly right. I wonder if he's thinking about those McConnell comments. Because those comments just make clear, this is going, if this gets to the point where it's even close to an election or just abutting an election, this is going to be a huge partisan, cluster, whatever, and it's going to be bad. And now is really the safe time to do this. And I don't even know how safe it is. Who knows? What happens in this Senate? I don't know. But if there was going to be a time to step down to be assured that a Democratic president could nominate your successor, now would be the time. And I can't imagine that he doesn't get that.
Yeah, and now would be the time to make the process as depoliticized as possible.
Right.
If he did it now. Especially, he's got to look at some of the judges who've just been confirmed in the Senate have gotten confirmed with pretty lopsided margins, right?
His former clerk, Ketanji Brown Jackson.
I was just about to say that, right? So Ketanji Brown Jackson gets confirmed with, a healthy majority. And if he stepped down now and if Biden appointed her to the Supreme Court, you would expect at least that the Republicans who just voted for her for the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals would do the same. Thanks to Professor Melissa Murray for joining us as well. And everyone have a great week. The first episode of Edith is out. We partnered with our friends at Q-Code to produce a new scripted comedy starring Rosamund Pike that explores the untold, true-ish story of America's secret first female president, Edith Wilson, the First Lady to Woodrow Wilson. New episodes of Edith are released every Thursday. Follow on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. Exciting, guys.
Everybody check out Edith. It's very good. You will like it.
It's very funny.
Subscribe to it right now.
I laughed hard on the way to the office in the morning, where we don't have any AC, guys. So I'm living in
I'm staying
our
away
climate
from that
feature.
office then. Yep,
Yeah.
Okay. There, no thank you. Also, this week, Love It or Leave It presents Out of the Closets into the Streets, a live Pride extravaganza filled with games, comedy, sets, and of course, gay news. Love
Gay
it.
news.
Tell
Lots
us
of
all
gay
about
news.
it.
We have an incredible lineup. It is on Thursday at 4 o'clock. You can Pacific, 7 o'clock Eastern. You can watch it live. It'll also be Love It or Leave It that Saturday. But we're really excited about it. We have an incredible lineup of guests, and we're raising money for the Trans Justice Funding Project, which puts money into local organizations across the country fighting for trans people, led by trans people. So we're very excited about this event. The lineup will be announced soon. It is amazing. So check it out.